In January 1941, with Europe in the grip of the Second World War, Henri Matisse was fighting his own very private battle. At the age of 71, he had to undergo major invasive surgery, a procedure that would have threatened the life of much younger men. Such was his joy at being given a second chance at life, Matisse worked around his new physical limitations and devised a whole new way of making pictures, cutting shapes out of coloured sheets of paper, a process he called drawing with scissors. This body of work hasn't been seen anywhere for 27 years, and this is the first time it's in the UK. So here we are at Tate Modern for an exhibition of Matisse's cutouts and an overview of his incredible Indian summer. So really the breakthrough project for Matisse and his cutouts was the jazz book he made in 1946. And one of the most famous illustrations from that is this one of Icarus. Now, Icarus was the mythological figure who flew too close to the sun with the false wings he'd made, and the wax melted and he tumbled back through the sky and fell to his death. And that's the scene that ostensibly Matisse has recreated here. But given that the timing that this was made, it's interesting to think about what other things this could show. So it's produced in 1946, the year after the conclusion of the very violent Second World War. And we could see the black figure of Icarus falling back through the sky, almost as being the outline of a corpse. It looks like a sort of CSI scene. And these little yellow, what are stars, if we think about it in the conventional way, could be taken to be sort of bomb explosions. And in this black silhouette, we have this little red dot, which has to be taken to be the heart of this figure. And it doesn't look like it could possibly be powering the life of this guy. And so it's a very suggestive picture of an expiring life. Now, it's always possible to read too much into these things, but given the timing and given the sort of magnitude of the era, it's difficult not to read in sort of war references to some of these pictures. Now, in the way that Matisse uses the primary colours in these early cutouts for the jazz book, and the way he offsets them against white and black, he kind of looks 16 years ahead of his time, really, because if you think about the pop art stuff we've looked at previously, this palette is straight out of Liechtenstein. So Matisse, in using these very simple graphic forms, maybe he was the one anticipating pop art. Now, one of the thrilling things at this exhibition is the archive footage that shows how Matisse made the work. Now, he had his assistants prime huge sheets of paper and cover them with very strong coloured gouache. And he'd have them feed it to him, and using the big sort of tailor's scissors, almost like performance art. So he, in the jazz books, he paints sword swallowers and jugglers and acrobats, and that's kind of how he was in making the work. It was a very spontaneous, live performance, and the speed with which he, as an old man, he manipulated those scissors is quite incredible to watch. So we're in a room here that has some of Matisse's cutouts and some of his late paintings. And I was wondering, how much do you see the cutout as a poor substitute for the painting he could no longer do?
Well, the point of this room is really to show that there's this hinge in his career where he's been working on cutouts for several years, really beginning them as compositional tools to create something else, whether it's a book cover or a tapestry. And then gradually, through the 1940s, he becomes more and more excited about the technique. And so you see this incredible wall behind me with a gathering of the small cutouts, just the array of colours and forms that he's working in. But At the same time he's making these, he's also painting. And so on the other wall, you have two of Matisse's final paintings, which are amongst the best he ever made. They're really extraordinary compositions. And so the point is, after he finishes these paintings in 1948, he chooses to stop painting. He can still paint, but he's so entranced by the cutout technique, which is essentially a medium he's developed for himself, that for the last 6 years of his life, he just focuses on cutouts. So we were quite keen to dispel this idea that he's only doing these because he can't paint. Yeah. And these two walls proves that to be false.
So having built an international reputation as a painter, which is a very daring thing to do, how was this critically received in his lifetime while he was doing it?
Well, the initial reception of the cutouts, it's slow because they're first seen as essentially lithographs. They begin as illustrations for books like Jazz, and in the previous room we have all of the 20 original maquettes, the designs, with the book. So first of all they're seen as books, and there's general admiration for the technique, but he's still really thought of as a painter. And then gradually in the 1940s, with commissions like the Vance Chapel, where he designed the stained glass windows using cutouts, more attention is given to them. However, still, even by the early 1950s, he's still really thought of as a painter. And the thing to say is that this technique was really ahead of its time. It's quite radical and new. And Matisse said that it would take many years for people to fully apprehend and understand what he'd done. So the reception of the cutouts took some time to really reach the level that it is now.
So the same trick that Matisse put to good use in making the Jazz book, which was having the coloured bright pictures against the black of this handwriting, he repeated in the decorative scheme in the Vance Chapel. Now, the amazing thing about that space is the way that the colour comes through the stained glass and works with and in harmony with the black and white ceramic mural, the drawings he made. Now, the Jazz book was all about circus performers and acrobats and magicians, and some say that Matisse was never closer to being a performance artist himself than when he stood making these drawings. So the way he made these very, very large compositions was standing in front of them with charcoal on the end of a bamboo stick and drawing very freely, which is how he sort of got this spontaneous looking continuous line drawing the Virgin and Child, the only directly religious imagery he made in the entire scheme. Well, Flavia, it's great to be here in this room that contains all the preliminary designs for the Vance Chapel. Now, something that interests me is, why did Matisse, the lifelong atheist, want to do a religious commission like this? What do you think it was that attracted him to the chapel project?
I think what really attracted him to the chapel project is not so much the religious component, but really the opportunity to design a whole decorative scheme on this scale. So it was, you know, for the first time he could really design a whole architectural environment. So that's what really drew him to the project.
So this chapel was the first time he really worked on a big, large-scale commission using the cutouts. Do you think what kind of an important stage was it for Matisse to make this chapel, and what confidence did that give him for commissions and work following the chapel project?
I think, one, it gave him a huge boost of confidence in the cutouts medium, in the sense that working on such a large scale for the chapel meant that he really recognized this medium as something he could do more with, and this is what we see further on. But also it's like, you know, the ability of doing a whole scheme in this way was that he worked on it, he was really immersed, living in what he created, his own kind of chapel in his studio, which he called a factory. He lived at the chapel for several years while working on it. So it was kind of a very immersive,
almost collapsing the distinction between his studio and the working process and the finished product. I mean, he lived and breathed the Vance Chapel for years before it was realized.
Yes. I mean, for him, it really was those moments, those years when he was living, breathing, sleeping in it, that really made the chapel.
I wonder if there's something about the extremes of Catholicism that worked well with the extreme approach Matisse had to his work. So there's something about devotion and penance and sacrifice that seems to sort of chime very well with Matisse's own working methods.
I guess, yes, devotion, he's definitely very devoted to his work. I don't think he perceives it in a religious way. It's like a devotion to the bigger kind of God of art, if you can say that. But.
Well, exactly. He said that he believed in God when he worked. That's his sort of religiosity.
Yes,
in the preparations for the drawing of the Stations of the Cross on the mural in the Vons Chapel, Matisse practiced again and again the different drawings to the extent that by the end he said he could draw them blindfolded. Just wondering, should we think of Matisse as being a spontaneous artist or a very exacting planner?
I think you need to think of Matisse as an exacting planner of spontaneity. That's really what he's trying to do. So he's rehearsing them endlessly because the idea is, in the moment he takes his very long stick and has to draw the final version of the Stations of the Cross on the ceramic panels, he feels he needs to be able to do it in a go, it needs to come to him naturally. And that kind of spontaneity can only be achieved by rehearsing. So I think if the two can exist, then they exist in this instance.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good explanation. Now, talking about Matisse's cutouts without having the Vons Chapel stained glass windows is a bit like talking about Michelangelo's murals without having the Sistine Chapel. Now, we don't have the Vons designs here, but what we do have is this design for the Christmas Eve window in the Time Life building, which Matisse made in 1952. And this gives you an idea of just how much the medium of stained glass lends itself to this cutout style design. It's essentially the same process of cutting out shapes from blocks of color. And although this window doesn't have the same tranquil harmony of the Vons composition, we can see here some of the colors that he used there. So we have the sort of bottle green, the sapphire blue, the limoncello yellow that are also effective in those Vons windows, all used here in this apparently religious scene without any actual religious imagery. I think this window is a good example of Matisse's religiosity, which is he was able to find that transcendent note without actually directly appealing to Christian imagery. As you walk around this exhibition, you really get the impression of someone who was obsessed with creating. And that's what Matisse, for me, has in common with all the great artists, that eccentric addiction to making pictures and expressing yourself. So what I love about the way the nudes fit into the story is that after 4 years of severe piety in making the sort of religious commission of the Vons Chapel, Matisse was itching to get back to his favourite subject, the female form. One of the major ways in which this exhibition is significant is that the very famous Blue Nude series is all here together in the UK for the first time. Now, it's always a shock to come face to face with the object when you're dealing with an icon, but this is the case here, perhaps more than with other works, because as you get very close to the object, you can see that Matisse has made no effort at all to hide the process. So you can see the charcoal lines where he's rejigged the composition. You can see the little scraps of blue paper, which is almost used like clay in sculpting this languorous figure of this nude. Now, he obviously tried out all kinds of different poses before he settled on one he was happy with. And what a pose he did settle on, this unlikely sort of yoga-esque pose with her arm behind her head and her right leg spiraling in an unlikely way around her left leg. Now, this took about 2 weeks to complete. And And when he was finally happy with it, this sort of drawing with scissors, when he finally settled on this composition, he then made the next 3 in the series in a matter of hours, one after another, in a sort of spontaneous move. And when you see the final product, the smooth final product, it's a thrillingly economical way of picture making. So the white space left by the cutout is what maps out the contours of this woman. Now, Francois Gillot, who was an artist companion of Picasso, said that Matisse had the audacity of simplicity. And I think that's exactly right. He has this amazing sense of reducing things down to their simplest, most sensual essence. And that in nowhere is that better exemplified in the Blue Nude series. I've always thought Matisse is quite poorly represented in UK collections. And I notice you're now based in America, and a lot of Matisse's greatest works are over there. Why do you think it is that Americans take to Matisse perhaps more than the British have?
Well, I think one major factor, it's quite simple, but his son, Pierre Matisse, was a dealer, had a gallery in New York, which is very important. And even in this exhibition, Pierre was able to secure many commissions for him. So some of the late works you see were commissions from American patrons that Pierre Matisse brought to his father. So I think that's one reason. That said, the Tate has the snail, which is not bad. It's one of the very best cutouts. And when we began the exhibition 5 years ago, that was really, in a way, the spur, that we had the snail, and it made sense to build an exhibition around it. So we've got one great one.
Yeah, and as long as I can remember, the Tate collection has itself revolved around the snail to a certain extent. And I think that was bought in 1962.
It was.
How was that received at the time that Tate was spending this money on some paper cutouts?
Well, this was 8 years after Matisse died, so it was actually quite an early acquisition to make, although other cutouts had reached museums before that. And it went for, I want to say, I think it was at the time £23,000, around that much. I couldn't be precise, but
sounds about right.
So I think it's about right. And that was seen as being rather expensive and maybe ill-advised. So, but you have to remember, this was a moment in post-war Britain when the reception of modern and contemporary art took some time. It's not just about Matisse and the cutouts, but generally there was resistance towards spending public money on modern and contemporary art.
So this is the snail, which has long been a sort of star attraction at the Tate, and it's looking beautiful now it's been restored for this exhibition. Now, it's only when you get close to this you realise what a physical object it is. So this was made in 1953, the year before Matisse died, and he was in a sort of race against time to create these heroic works in the time he had left. And so as you get close to these sort of 11 blocks of bright colour, you can see that sometimes he dispensed with scissors altogether and just tore straight into the papers. It's a very physical quality, and it's great to get close. You can still see the watermark on the paper, and the bright colours 60 years later don't look any dimmer. It's amazing to think that when he was working, Matisse had to wear sunglasses to protect himself against the sort of barrage of strident colours he was subjecting himself to daily. This is one of the more abstract works that Matisse ever made. Now, it's called The Snail, and it's loosely arranged as sort of around a spiral composition, like a snail's shell. But something that's often been said over the years is this really captures a sort of childlike joy of colour and art. And one of the most sort of trite, oft repeated quotes about art is Picasso saying that every child is born an artist, the trick is staying one. Now, Matisse managed to stay as an artist. Maybe Matisse was a sort of pleasant bridge into abstraction, because that snail painting is probably his most abstract work, and so actually it was one of the more palatable ways of sort of introducing that kind of new art to the country.
Perhaps, that's interesting. I mean, it's certainly one of the most abstract works he ever made. He always slightly resisted the term abstraction.
Yes.
And of course, even the snail has a reference because it's describing the spiral of a snail shell. But it is one of the works that brings him the closest to abstraction. I'm
standing in front of a huge work called The Parakeet and the Mermaid. And this is a garden that Matisse created on the walls of his own house and studio. The distinction sort of collapsed. And the thing I like about this is that it shows as Matisse's life got smaller and smaller, as he became more frail and more infirm and less able to go outside, what he did was bring the outdoors indoors. And what he's made for himself here is this incredible, exotic fantasy garden, this explosion of sort of leaves and pomegranates and parakeets and even a mermaid, which he settled on after many attempts of jiggling the composition and trying different things in the space. And it's just amazing to think that his work really took on a monumental scale when he was at his least physically able. Now, we're very lucky in London, and we throw the phrase once-in-a-lifetime exhibition around quite a lot. Do you think that's true of this one? Will we ever see the cutouts collected like this again?
I don't think so. I mean, the last major exhibition, which had about 50 odd works, was in 1977 in North America. And so, 36 years later, we have this exhibition. This has 130. And the reality is these are very difficult works to borrow, to gather together, to travel. I would be surprised even if in my lifetime I'm able to see such a gathering of the cutouts. So I think this might be a once-in-a-lifetime exhibition. But we're not, you never want to throw that around.
No.
That should mean something. But I think here it does.
Yeah. This is an inspiring and uplifting exhibition about a man whose work became ever more ambitious and monumental as his own life became smaller because of physical disability. The visceral power of these works is still the same as it was when they hit the cutting room floor in the 1950s. These are the cutouts of Henri Matisse.